Okay, great. Thank you for waiting, guys. I think we should begin. So I guess first I would like to speak briefly about Jasper Bernes, the author of these wonderful essay, and he is first and foremost a communist. I think he's self-described Marxian artist. And he's also a professor of English at UC Berkeley. And his dissertation was the work of art in the age of the industrialization. And it's actually pretty good. You know, it's a nod to Walter Benjamin. And so he's also, I think, editor of Commune magazine, or was Commune Editions now. And he's also a poet. And I mean, yeah, he's a really interesting thinker, and I want to thank him for being so supportive. Yeah, exactly. RP Commune magazine, yeah, it's missed. So I guess if you want to share with us first impressions so far of the essay, this is the time. Thank you.
Hey, I'll start. I don't know how many of you were with us during the last series in this, or the last episode in this series of this reading group, but we read another of Jasper Bernes' work called The Belly of the Revolution. And I believe that was published in 2018. This one, the Revolutionary Motives, is from 2019, so it's his most recent publication. So we read Belly of the Revolution, and we all thought it was really interesting and liked it a lot. And we wanted to continue on with his work. And that one was kind of a more big picture. I don't know. I'm not assuming everyone here's read it, so I'll just kind of, I won't say too much, but that was kind of a more big picture kind of social theory, you know, of how capitalism is deeply intertwined with technology and with the infrastructure of the modern world, and how a post-capitalist society would have to question a lot of the forms that technology and infrastructure has taken, particularly in the context of food production. So the essay is really about agriculture, first and foremost. But this essay that we read this time, Revolutionary Motives, is more about, it's basically trying to develop a theory of why people revolt, most simply. And it's different from the last one in that sense. And this group that we have, it formed as sort of we called it value theory reading group. This essay isn't really so much doing that, but I think it's connected in a broad sense. And we can talk about that, just kind of what Bernes' understanding of capitalism is, what keeps people in line, basically what keeps, what holds society together. And in order to understand how people might revolt. So yeah, I wanted to, just, I guess someone else can step in.
I think it has a really strong beginning thesis. And in the first paragraph, he immediately addresses the objective and the fact that we have historically evaluated the revolutionary processes, but it's only through certain anthropological or psychological analysis that we can really condense the reasons for why this process revolt, or more concretely, why don't they? So any first words? Anyone wants to share anything about the first segment of the essay? Thank you.
Yeah, hi. I think it's interesting that he opens up with these questions: why do people revolt, or more importantly, why don't they? He's kind of bring right away into the top of the conversation this question of knowledge. We think we understand what led up to certain revolutions, or we think we know the causes why there was inertia in other ones. But then there's a nice little bit, I think, on page 195. I'll just read the quote. The pedagogical and pastoral assumptions are at the heart of the process that allowed revolution to turn to counter-revolution. Those who say they don't know now may find themselves at a practical and intuitive level relying on common sense conceptions later on. And from that, I took as a kind of undermining of these questions of why do we know, or why do we don't know, or how can we know, as this system whereby when we say that there are certain things we don't know, what we're doing is we're kind of legitimizing the things that we claim we do know as knowledgeable or knowable or even good or true. So in other words, in any case, whatever set of knowledge we have as historically, that was always produced by a certain group who presumably couldn't have fully known, but they produced a certain set of knowledge and answers and historical reasons, which obviously are there to advance more of a certain set of interests and to guide historical study in order to legitimize certain current events. And so we always have so right away at the beginning of this essay, there was this kind of epistemological, kind of spoke in the wheels or fly in the ointment, where even trying to get at questions of what do we know, what do we don't know, itself has to be opened up to why do we claim certain things as knowable or unknowable. So that was an interesting way for me to start the essay. And of course, where I think he goes towards the end, which we'll get to later, is much more substantive in terms of looking forward and looking positive. But that first stage, I felt I had to proceed carefully because of this epistemological uncertainty about knowledge production. And I wanted did that anyone else did that resonate with anyone else, or did anyone else pick up on that? Or
yeah, I think that's there. I think definitely. And then he goes into the whole game theory and stuff to sort of get it more clear. But another current that I think is interesting is there seems to be, I don't know if discomfort is the right word or something, but there's you don't want to have a vanguard anymore, right? He establishes that rather quickly, that would lead to counter revolution or whatever. So there's some discomfort or some anxiety about the role of intellectual, or perhaps what's our job then? What are we gonna do? Right? I'm not sure if discomfort is the right term, but I think that's a current in the text as well. We as people who are thinking about what a revolution might look like, or how it's supposed to happen, or blah blah blah, or who read Marx, what's our job if we cannot take the role of vanguard? What's our job? That there's some uncertainty about that as well, that I think runs through the essay, which I thought was interesting.
Right.
Certainty,
but there wasn't as well, because I think it comments on that particularly. Anyway.
Sorry?
I think it comments on that at some point on the essay as well, saying that the role, basically the point is you need to disentangle the didactism from the fact that you are creating ideas. So basically treating the ideologues to people that can create ideas. Was it in this essay? Sorry, it took me, it's been a few weeks now, but I think the idea there, or at least in my mind after reading a few things, has always been the debate that needs to be had is the ideologues should not disappear, and they are always going to exist. The question is, how do we use the information that they generate, and how do we judge? Meaning, it shouldn't be that they drive all behavior, but they are very useful for the cynical view on everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I think precisely by the cynical view, there is some counter things that actually also link with what Mike was saying, to what extent the new reality of the knowns will also, by the analysis from a cynical perspective, will never be a finished product. I found that interesting.
Mm.
I found also interesting if maybe someone can talk about how do they describe the notion of motive in people?
Yeah, am I mute? No. Yeah, motive. I mean, when he says something about like, you know, everyone's got motives, but having a certain motive doesn't necessarily mean you will act on it a certain way. There are always going to be social conditions which will then shape the way a motive manifests itself into action, and that, you know, I mean, so that's something I like, because that kind of harkened back to things we talked about in older value group discussions, maybe like you know, Deleuze and then Masumi as well. You know, where you have these either, you know, desire or intensity, which is not really for anything, but it's kind of this fuel, this motivating fuel, this motive that can, you know, be channeled and co-opted and captured, but also kind of encouraged and set free. So yeah, that's, for me, motives, you know, kind of was a lot like that. The Deleuzian concept of desire, or the stuff we talked about, intensities, and I like that. I thought that was a nice way to link it up with old readings, and to think about motives as opposed to self-interest, which I think, you know, he talks about as something a little more contemplated, and then of course there's simply just knee-jerk reactions. I mean, motives is something a little, you know, it holds this place in between something that's deeply contemplated and long-term, as opposed to something that's just purely reactionary and instinctual. I'm probably still closer to the latter. But it's, you know, it's fuel that can be shaped, that can be directed in different directions, you know?
Right. And he brings up Spinoza pretty early on in the essay too. But I think the concept of motive he's developing here is pushing back against what he calls the pedagogical approach to you know, radical social change, which I think he belongs. There are two categories he's kind of pushing back against. He calls them the pastoral, which includes Lenin under, and then pedagogical, which includes Gramsci under. The idea that you can that basically, like, revolutionary activity it requires reshaping people's beliefs and desires, like through, you know, through ideological work or activity, or and he says you can't. Jasper Bernes says you can't unteach hunger. He's trying to theorize this deeper level of motive that's more, he says, more elemental. More similar to Spinoza's concept of the conatus. And he includes, like, desire for food, shelter, and just like absence of pain, basically these very elemental motives that drive people in certain directions, regardless of the kinds of ideological, you know, ideas that might be floating atop those more elemental or basic motives. And that's kind of what I thought the point of developing that concept is, to dig down deeper.
I can only say a little bit about the actual essay, because I caught on to this reading group rather late, and haven't read it all. Very thing, but I really like this in many ways. And just in terms of the very beginning, he develops a bunch of kind of contradictions about motives in the way you might normally think about them. So linking motives to, like, the underlying frameworks of, like, hunger. You know, you can't unlearn hunger was a great phrase. But he's also looking at people's choices and how they, you know, in some sense arguing that people are free, people make their own choices. And that's where the starting point of the essay is, you know, to say, why do they make their choices? I would point people to some kind of, I do sociology kind of stuff, and a really interesting framework on that would be Goffman. Frame analysis has been used by social movement theorists to talk about, you know, how people frame an issue that enables a lot of people to engage with something and see it in a particular way. And doesn't necessarily have to be done as a pedagogical or and certainly not even a pastoral way. But one of the more recent books was The Explanation of Social Action by a fellow named John Levy Martin. And it's not a book about revolutions. It's just a book for sociologists who are trying to figure out, well, look, how do you talk about why people do things without saying, well, they were compelled to do them by some other force, which is kind of a more traditional sociology way, both, you know, to do a bunch of statistics and frame a structure and say structures tell people or force people what they have to do. And obviously, and what like John Levy Martin argues is that social field theory is maybe the way to think about how people look at the world and see what they can do. So I don't know how much this will relate to this kind of underlying concept of motives. And again, my actual question is, are revolutionary motives different from you know, the larger motives of the, if you want to say the working class? Maybe that's something he gets into at the beginning, but he certainly distinguishes. I love the term adventurous. People can be adventurous rather than vanguardists and what kind of motives do they have versus what kind of motives do other people who have, and what kind of choices they might have. Similar motives if they both are hungry, but the choices they make in many cases might be different. So that maybe I'll put some of those references in there. And that, because John Levy Martin also talks about game theory and how that's used in many ways, covering some of these similar areas, but in a very, you know, the question about how do you explain what people do as sociology rather than the specific question that is asked here by Jasper Bernes.
I mean, he doesn't really make it so clear, like what separates revolutionary motives from other kind of motives. I think he writes that, well, ordinary motives can be more habitual, which is of course not the case in a revolution. But other than that, I didn't really see any difference. Anyone would like to enlighten me?
Yeah, Michael, that's interesting. You bring up sort of just the sociological theory world, because one thing I think it's important to point out, and I was kind of just gesturing at this, the first thing I said about just like what is Bernes's concept of capitalism, sort of how is society held together in the first place. In order to understand why, like how and why people revolt, we sort of have to understand how it's held together in the first place. And he's working with basically, I think, a Marxist understanding of what the ultimate glue that holds society together is. And I would juxtapose that with you know, different kinds of ideas about what holds society together that come out of the bourgeois sociological tradition, like Durkheim, but also some Marxists like Althusser. They basically think that society is held together by people's ideological representations or their beliefs or their values, things like that. For Marx, it's the dull compulsion of economic relations that gets people up every morning, gets them to go to work. I'm just going to quote something on page 196 from this essay. Bernes says, "Humans will strive to feed themselves, to find shelter from the elements, and to avoid pain and illness, to speak of the three most basic material motives. In capitalism, these basic motives fuel the fires of accumulation. The apparatus of the wage, for example, depends upon the motivated yet free actions of proletarians who, dispossessed of the means of production, voluntarily sell their labor power in order to survive. Proletarians are not gripped by capital at the neuromuscular level, their bodies directly recruited to produce things of value. Domination and power is everywhere, in its history thousands of years deep, but people are almost never the simple objects or tools of others." So he's working with this sort of Marxist concept of the everyday motives that drive people to action. It's sometimes translated as dull compulsion, sometimes as mute compulsion. But it's quite different from in the sociological tradition of Durkheim and Weber, people being motivated by values or collective representations about what's good. For Marx, it's a more basic, it's driven yet free action. And the revolutionary motives are also operating at that level. They're operating beneath the level of ideological representations, even though they're always in some way, they're in some way oriented by those ideological representations, but that's not what's ultimately gripping people at a very basic level. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I find the metaphor proletarians gripped by capital at the neuromuscular level. I mean, you know, it's very, very sci-fi, and you know, clearly some sort of fever dream of capital to be able to do that. But then again, what comes after, you know, that it says even those forms of domination which we imagine to operate almost entirely through force, ... presume some limited margin of freedom. And I was wondering, is it just the presumption of freedom that itself that allows domination to try and dominate and manipulate motives, or is it that freedom is there and you know, authority needs to at least acknowledge it in some way in order to exercise itself? But yeah, I mean, there's very little about freedom in the whole piece, but you know, the concept of freedom in regard to the concept of motives is interesting, because you know, if we're motivated by these things called motives, or in what Dan said, Marx's explanation is, you know, the more material constraints of, you know, staying alive, is that a freedom? So what kind of freedom is presumed by forms of domination?
And maybe just comment on that bit that you quoted was towards the beginning. So I've read that, and that really actually helped me think about maybe the difference between exploitation as a sort of, you know, the traditional Marxist or anarchist theory of how capitalism exploits people, and domination. So in the transition, and using motives to think about that transition from feudalism to capitalism. So in feudalism, the peasants have land, and they kind of, and their motives are developed to grow the material, to create you know, to grow the crop, the wealth, and domination comes and takes it away. Whereas in capitalism, people are dispossessed of the commons, and then it is it's basically your motives are there to encourage you to, by your own free will, to go into exploitation. And so it's your free will that you volunteer to be a wage laborer. Now, obviously, the domination is set up backwards behind the capitalist exploitation, because otherwise people would reclaim the commons, or they would do something different in the legal system, right? So the domination is sort of removed, and then becomes so kind of structural. So most people don't make the choice to do something confrontational. It's just easier to work for their wage labor. And today, when we have what we call, like, you know, might say, you know, capitalist or managerial feudalism, you see that it's when the capitalist system expands so that it can't make profits just on what it has been doing, it's actually starting to use exploit domination again to try to extract, like a sort of a feudalism within our own system, a rentier capitalism, that tries to, even though now it's not so much peasants as information peasants who are already wage laborers, but they, or the precarious, but they are at least felt entitled to work for a wage, work within that community, and now even more is being extracted from them. So that sort of helped me think about that difference between exploitation and domination. I don't know if that's useful, but the concept of motives underneath that.
Yeah, that's really great. And you know, also if you talk about now with you know, a growing sector of the economy being whatever they call a knowledge economy or tech service workers and all that stuff, it's the giving the employees this extra sense of freedom to do more stuff that actually generates more potential wealth and value for the company as well. And of course, these kind of jobs didn't exist at all in feudalism, you know. So the transition from domination to exploitation through the presumption of freedom, yeah, that's a really good way to put it. Thanks.
So I guess if no one has any more sort of comments or questions about the concept of motives for now, I mean, it's going to come back up at the end a little bit, but we could move on to sort of the next sort of section of the essay, which is when he starts going through, some of you might have been turned off by this sort of goes through Manker Olson and the sort of the problem of collective action. And then he gets into some game theory and stuff like that. It's sort of just like him reading through different, approaches to the problem of collective action, and kind of finding some interesting things in each one, but kind of seeing their limits. And then he also he has a reading of a really excellent essay, I think, in Endnotes 4 called A History of Separation. It's sort of just a history of the workers' movement and its rise and fall. And yeah, I mean, he talks about it in more detail in here, but I guess we could just move on to that section of the essay.
I don't know. I skimmed the text, right? I was a kid and everything, but this motive stuff, like, is the question of ideology completely bracketed there? Because harking back to people like Deleuze and Guattari, right? They talk about interest and they talk about desire, and at some point in some texts they say our interest is where our desire puts it. Meaning, if you identify perhaps through some notion of the American dream or whatever with the higher class, then you might vote for Trump and you might vote for tax cuts, even though that's against your class interest, right? And I think I don't know, is that bracketed? As I said, I skimmed the text, but it seems that that's where ideology comes in and where these kind of things come in. And like if you just focus on motives in terms of like, hey, I'm hungry, I need food, I'm cold, I need shelter. Is that all bracketed or not? Because this level of desire is, it seems to me, often much more effective in rallying people.
Well, I think maybe that motives was, presumed to be there, and something like an ideology is what can give shape to the motives, and to help people. So people have these motives, but ideology was what makes them decide to vote Trump or whatnot. But I think there's also a lot of people voting against their class interest. That just comes from, the fantasy that one day they'd like to be part of that group.
Yeah, for sure.
I think a historical framework is helpful to the essay as a device to the questions you were pondering, Dennis, because he evaluates the revolutionary attempts from different perspectives and periods in history, and he tries to examine. I mean, there's always the martyrization of the revolutionary and the insurgent figure. So if there are those that will struggle and fight until the end, and death will be the reception, what about those that surrender? And he wants to examine mostly the, I guess, coalition and the in between individual interest and collective communal interest, and I think that observation is very helpful to understand what motive means. I think if I were to just reduce it to the core, I would perhaps address the fact that he mentions those counter-revolutionary measures, and in which people who had an ideological alignment in common against the state or the capitalist later on surrender, and he wants to examine why that took place.
I think the ideology issue gets confused in the sense of it's a bit of a social construct to say there is a working class that all believes in the same thing and wants to do the same thing and they might have in some sense interests and motives, but if your motive is hunger or you want to get ahead or you get a better situation, you might do better by siding with your boss, right? You don't have, like, if your motive is to get ahead, you can do better by joining the important people and leaving behind some other people. So lots of people look at their social situation and think, well, it doesn't look like there's going to be a revolution. And anybody who believes this idea of your class interest and goes out for a revolution doesn't do that well. In particular situations. In other situations, they do well. And so therefore, I'm going to take the interests of how do I better my situation? I know there's a hierarchy. I'm just going to move myself one step up in it. Because like tomorrow, I can get one step up in the hierarchy. But the revolutionary who talks about, that you have to take away the secret goggles of ideology, see that when we all work together, well, they're always promising a revolution way down the line when everybody believes that they should work together, which, many people count up almost like game theory, and they think, well, I'm better off tomorrow by doing this. And, this revolution where all working class people will join together, I don't see it right away. So motives helps look at maybe ideology differently. And maybe with someone like Trump, right, we're all like Americans just as racist as Trump. Well, I mean, obviously, growing up in America, I know there's a huge amount of racism there, but it's very subliminal, not so obvious in some sense. And something like Trump does this authorizing behavior. So, for example, he has for a long time supported historically Black colleges and gave them money and supported them. And so that is then circulated as an enabling factor for people who are told, who kind of want to believe in Trump anyways, because they like some of the things he says. But then they say, well, he's really racist. And then they say, oh, well, here's this thing he did. And so there's a simple, it's this one-off thing that, is that ideology, or is it simple, or would there be a better theory to explain that?
On page 212, he addresses this particular question. He says, but in almost all countries, the proletarian vote was never large enough for proletarian parties to conquer electoral power on their own, unless they form coalitions with other parties or other class fractions. Therefore, proletarian parties were forced to either forsake the conquest of electoral power or seek out participants from other classes, where pursuit of the latter would require weakening the class program of the party. But this weakening would, in turn, dissolve proletarian identification with the party and undermine the basis of proletarian belonging as such, leading proletarians to seek out other parties who might represent their interests on the basis of other forms of identification, Catholicism or whiteness, for example.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that was that section of the essay where he's reading Przeworski and sort of these analytical Marxists, Klaus Hofe and Helmut Wiesenthal, that sort of famous essay called Two Logics of Collective Action, and Manker Olson. All that I thought was really a sort of a critical reading of all of them, because it was saying that the context of reasoning that that the workers' movement of the 20th century, the context of their reasoning and bargaining strategies and stuff like that, in sort of the social democratic image of a slow but steady, revolution from trade unions and parliamentary politics, just was doomed to failure, because through an analysis of the workers' movement, we can see that, like, the only country in the world where the working class, the industrial working class, was more than 50% was Belgium. It never broke 50% anywhere else, and that passage is very important, I think, in this essay, because he's not arguing his image of the proletarians who are going to revolt. It's not the industrial working class; it's much wider, and the working class and proletariat do not have the same extension. Proletariat has a much wider extension than the industrial working class, or just the working class in general. Proletariat just means people without reserves, basically. But yeah, so he's moving through all these theorists in the middle sort of meat of the essay, in order to criticize their image of revolution, which is an image of collective bargaining, basically, and saying it's not realistic.
Right. I think it would be helpful to perhaps have an overview of the forms in which, again, with the historical framework, these attempts have been implemented. And for example, we have the vanguardist attempt, which was, as described, pastoral and relied on, again, ideology, as you guys have mentioned, and that through leadership, I think he even like provided an example that those that were intended to lead the working class into this new level of consciousness would have to like hang out with them and pay, like sell newspapers, and later on try to proselytize. And there are other attempts that he listed, which vary in some ways. Do you want to cover that, Dan? I mean, it's like I think the beginning of the essay, but I mean the vanguardist attempt and the voluntarist, the pastoral and the
yeah. I'll just say very briefly, and I sent that email with the supplementary reading of this other very short essay that Bernes wrote with another guy named Joshua Clover like 6 or 7 years ago, where they're just talking sort of about the dead ends of the state as a vehicle for radical, revolutionary change, like, and whether it's taking the state slowly and gradually in the social democratic model, or whether it's the Leninist sort of revolutionary seizure model. In both circumstances in the 20th century, or in any context of capitalist society, but in the real existing examples of say like a revolutionary seizure, once you're in control of state power, you're still under the constraints of accumulation, and you're still under the constraints of ramp, like in the context of Russia in 1917, just like ramping up the productive forces in order to accumulate, in order to build up the military power necessary to defend yourself from outside, but also more importantly, just keeping up with the law of value, what Marx called the law of value. In order to be able to trade for the things you need on the outside, you have to produce productively with basically capitalist methods. The state is just under, if left in its form, in its basic form and outlines of a modern, industrial capitalist society, it's going to just be under all these constraints of accumulation. And so that's why, basically why Bernes is very skeptical of the state as a vehicle. It's the state itself is deeply intertwined with the nature of capitalist accumulation, and that's basically what it's for. And it's not a tool that you can just pick up and wield in a different manner very easily.
right. And I guess in the chat, it was Gramsci was mentioned, and so that's another example, right, of an attempt to instill through consciousness or class consciousness through ideology and through pedagogical means. And he briefly talked about that as well. Education as a way to obtain the emancipation of the working class.
Yeah, just to distinguish between the quote that you read on 212 has the word class fraction in it. And I think that word is used now regularly because Gramsci brought it in. But that's not Gramsci's solution. His solution is pedagogical. But his analysis has the class fraction in it. And that's, in some ways, that's also what Jasper Bernes, he's used the word class fraction, so he's got that in, and it also helps look at the difference about where we might think about ideology and motives.
Yeah, I'd like to read another quote from a few pages earlier that I thought connects well with the later one. This is when he's talking about Offa and Wiesenthal. So I'm not sure if in the end he fully agrees with it, but at the bottom of 209, there is not a single logic of collective action, but rather two logics, capitalist logic and a proletarian one. Whereas capitalists can translate all of their desires into money forms, needing nothing more than to find the optimum of a production function, proletarian desires are heterogeneous. So that's similar to what was written before, that this would be before, and that's the quote on 212 kind of discussed having to kind of compromise after the fact, whereas this is, about the inability to all get together and, have a lot more unity in their direction. But so I wonder, is the concept of motives possibly put opposed to what he just calls desires in this paragraph? So is perhaps Bernes saying that, if you could find a way to connect the bigger picture with this more basic concept of motives, it is one avenue towards getting the proletarian program as unified as, say, the capitalist one, and those motives still in some way being about the betterment of satisfying material needs or access to them. Because I think towards the end of the essay, when he does start talking about this, and sorry to jump ahead so much, is it does seem like it's a bit of like a bit of a dystopian war going on when I read it, but that might just be me. But yeah, not to jump ahead of that, but this quote on 209, I wanted to add that to this.
That's an important quote. I'm glad you read it. That's sort of the takeaway from that Two Logics of Collective Action essay. The idea that, capitalists can calculate their courses of action just in the quantitative medium of money, and workers basically, in order to have a basis of practical reasoning, they need to have a sort of unifying identity. And that was basically the task of the workers' movement in the late 19th and 20th century, to build this collective identity. And that Endnotes essay that he then moves on to discussing next is sort of about that. It's about the history of the workers' movement, the history of the construction of an identity around the worker, and sort of the limits of it, because not only, just like I said, like the industrial working class that image was thoroughly constructed around never was anywhere near even half in most countries of the population, but also by the 1970s, and certainly by the 80s and 90s, like the industrial working class was totally gutted in the Western world. There was an accumulation of industrial labor in China, but that's declining now too. I mean, just the organic composition of capital, what Marx would call, just the growing proportion of technology to human industrial labor is so great at this point that, like, yeah, I mean, that identity is gone, and it's not coming back, according to this perspective that Bernes is coming out of. There's not a Jacobin magazine sort of future for a new working class.
Is he kind of saying that we should stop focusing on identity as a model of organization?